Hello, my name is Camilla Elliott. I teach in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. And I've created a video workshop for you that aims to help you to write strong essays that integrate ideas with poetic form and cultural contexts. The other day I was speaking to a GCSE examiner who told me that students get absolutely no points simply for listing poetic devices or describing autobiography in a GCSE exam essay. What they have to do to get points is to integrate the form, the context, and the analysis of the poem all in one. And that's what this workshop aims to do. Let's start by reading the poem. She walks in beauty, like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best of dark and bright meet in her aspect and her eyes, thus mellowed to that tender light which heaven to gaudy day denies. One shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace, which waves in every raven tress, or softly lightens o'er her face, where thoughts serenely sweet express how pure, how dear their dwelling place. And on that cheek and o'er that brow, so soft, so calm, yet eloquent, the smiles that win, the tints that glow, but tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. Now you'll see from the slide there is a picture here that was used to illustrate the poem in the 19th century. And you'll see that the images and the ideas of love or beauty that are expressed in this poem, or at least of admiration, were seen to be very ethereal, very religious. And it makes it very difficult for us today to relate to this poem when we think about love and what love is and how love works. This seems quite alien in many ways. And what I'm really hoping by the end of this workshop is that there will be some vital things that we have learned together about this poem that makes it much more relevant to today, even as it is at such a distance from today. Okay, so let's go on to another argument, which I think might be even more interesting to many of you in terms of ideas. Okay, and what we're going to do is we're going to work on creating an argument that takes together formal issues, things like structure and poetic form, and we are going to tie them to some very interesting cultural issues that were going on then and that still go on today, even if you feel I cannot relate to this poem. Hopefully by the end of this, you're going to feel, yes, I can relate to this poem. There are ideas in this that really resonate with things that I see happening today and I think about today. We'll start with a formal focus. She Walks in Beauty is a type of poem called a blazon. What is a blazon? Well, first of all, it comes from a tradition describing coats of arms, which would feature symbols that powerful families would consider to represent them. So things like lions and dragons and those kinds of things. And these parts and pieces of the coat of arms would signify what they valued, who they thought they were, what their identities were, and how they liked to present themselves in public. This term is also adapted to describe a kind of poem that catalogues typically the physical attributes of its subject. This is usually a woman, and it would take the body parts and describe them using metaphors and often in a way that was elevating or deifying the subject. So that's the traditional form. There are other things that happen to the blazon in contemporary poetry, and you might discover that in some of your other reading. Let's look at an example of a very famous blazon written by Edmund Spenser, Epithalamium. Epithalamium is a lyric poem in praise of marriage, and he wrote this poem for his bride first, but also to publish it. Let's have a look at the body parts he chooses and also the metaphors he attaches to them. We're not just doing this to make a list, we're doing this to try to understand how women were valued in the blazon and what values they were attached to via metaphor. And this will tell us something about what men valued in society. Let's start now. Her long, loose yellow locks like golden wire, her goodly eyes like sapphires shining bright, her forehead ivory white, her cheeks like apples which the sun hath rudded, her lips like cherries, charming men to bite, her breast like to a bowl of cream uncrudded, her paps like lilies budded, her snowy neck like to a marble tower. What we have here, if we take a look, is we've got a primary value on the face with some attention to the neck and the bosom and the breasts. We don't go beyond that. But already we see that it's much more sexual than Byron's poem, which focuses maybe on the hair and the head and facial features. Let's look at what metaphors are used to value the woman. So we have precious metals, golden wire, we have precious stones, sapphires, we have ivory, which is another kind of commodity that's taken from animals, and at the bottom we have the marble tower. So we have things that men used to store treasure, to show their wealth, and to build defenses, to protect their power. We also have things that are pleasurable to eat. We have apples, we have cherries, we have cream, and we have flowers as well, lilies, decoration from nature. So what's happening is that the woman is being likened to the things that the man uses to have both pleasure and power in society. Her body is something to be colonized perhaps in marriage, just like all of these things many of them had been brought through colonial enterprise from other countries. But the blazon is not new to the Renaissance. We can find a widely read blazon in the Song of Solomon from the Hebrew Bible that was written around the 10th century BC. And what's quite striking to me is how much of the blazon here, which we're going to look at, resembles and repeats in Spenser's poem. And to me, even the opening line, "Behold thou art fair, my love, behold thou art fair," is very much like this opening line in Byron, "She walks in beauty." The initial statement, she's beautiful. Then we go into itemizing body parts, and we start here with the hair is as a flock of goats. Thy teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which came up from the washing, whereof every one bears twins, and none is barren among them. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet, thy temples are like a piece of pomegranate, thy neck is like the Tower of David, thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. You can see so many words repeating, so many ideas repeating in Spenser's poem centuries later. Now, if you were going to be a wealthy person at the time that this poem was written, you would probably have a lot of animals. You'd have herds of goats and sheep. So these are symbols of wealth. And we have the sheep that are especially prolific. They don't just give birth to one lamb. Every single one bears twins. They're clean, they're even, they're shorn. These are lovely white teeth that the woman has. We have the sense of valuable materials, this thread of scarlet. We have the fruit, the exotic, luscious fruit, and we have the idea of the tower, the place of defense and the place of fortress for men to protect their wealth. And again, we have the breasts. Although they're not like lilies, they feed among the lilies, and they're also like animals that are profitable for the men of that time. We also have an interesting moment in the Song of Solomon. The woman gets to speak quite a bit, and she talks about the fact that she's black and that people look down on her and have contempt for her, but she knows that she's absolutely beautiful. Byron also chose to focus on the darkness of this lady, and that isn't that common. We do have other examples of it. It tends to be the golden-haired beauties in the traditional Blazon. So now it's over to you again. What I'd like you to do is return to the poem and underline or write down all the words in the poem that represent the woman in religious or otherworldly language. So this deifying of the woman that is a characteristic of the Blazon in many instances. Also find the body parts, underline them, and think about, as you do this, how are they different? How are they the same from the body parts that were chosen by Spenser and Solomon? What's missing? What is this poem not celebrating? And then, this is a bit more challenging. Look and see what metaphors are there. You may not find many or any. And our task, after you've had a good think, and you start this, and we'll get together and think about it some more, is to think about what are the values that Byron is attaching to her body parts and what is being attached to them. So pause the video here, take a few minutes and do this work, and then you can press play again. Okay, again, you may have noticed things that I don't emphasize here, and you may have things to add, which is great. But I'm just going to share some of the things that I want to underline myself. So we look at religious or otherworldly language, and the first thing we find is that the Romantics very much romanticized and elevated and deified nature. So while there are some words in this poem that are religious, like heaven and nameless grace, and the phrase dwelling place in the second stanza, ideas about purity and days in goodness spent and being at peace with all below, and love being innocent, these are religious values and ideals. We also have this kind of deification through the cloudless climes and starry skies, which are the heavens in a kind of astronomical sense, not necessarily the residence of God. But there are all sorts of things here which are gently and somewhat naturally deifying her. The next thing that I asked you to look at is what the body parts are here. So if you look, highlighted in yellow here, we've got aspect, which is the countenance or the face, the eyes, the raven tress, again the face. We have the cheek, the brow, and smiles, which imply lips and teeth and a mouth. And then we go inward to the mind and the heart. So if you've been thinking about how are these different, you'll notice that there isn't the neck, the breast, the paps, and the more sexualized body. And also, there aren't many efforts to link these body parts to metaphors. Instead, they are linked to things like darkness and brightness and stars and skies. There's more of a focus on going inward into the woman, to look at her thoughts, serenely sweet, and to look at what might be in her mind and in her heart. And the values that are attached to her body parts are values of a mindset, an attitude, a mentality, a character, a behavior that is submissive, that is content, that is happy, that seeks to please others, and that is moral and good. So there is a little hint of the smiles that win, so that she might be sexually attractive, but he quickly moves to, but tell of days in goodness spent. So what's being valued here is her moral character. Time now to integrate our thoughts about poetic form with what's going on in the context and what's happening in writing of the time to anatomizing people and analyzing them and valuing them according to body parts. We're going to be looking at where the metaphors went and why they don't seem to be very prominent in this poem by Byron by comparison to other Blazons. And we're going to be looking at how and why the values attached to female body parts have changed by the time that Byron is writing. People in Byron's day were enormously interested in body parts and in chopping them up and separating them and analyzing them. In the late 18th century, Johann Caspar Lavater revived medieval theories of physiognomy, which is the science or the knowledge of the correspondence between external and internal man. What that means is we can know somebody's character and we can analyze their character by looking at their body, because the body and the soul are integrally intertwined, and the body is a metaphor for the soul. So that's where the metaphors went in a way. And if you look back to Byron's poem, you'll see that he's using body parts to read her character, her attitude, her mindset. So physiognomy was hugely popular. Now, there were lots of people who didn't really believe in it, but Lavater's book on physiognomy by the beginning of the 19th century was second only to the Bible in English homes. And one of the reasons it became so popular is that people were starting to move around more. They were starting to live in areas that were larger, where they didn't know everybody. And there was a kind of panic about, how do you know if somebody you meet in the street is going to hurt you or is going to harm you? But even more than that casual meeting, how do you know who to marry? How do you know who to make a business partnership with? How do you know who could be your servant and you could trust? And people used Lavater and wrote lots of essays and books about how to hire servants, how to look at the eyes, the nose, the hair, the lips, the mouth, the chin, the forehead, and so on, in order to understand what kind of character they would have. People wrote books about how to choose a marriage partner based on that, and even how to vote for politicians. How are we going to know if they're shady or we can trust them? So obviously not everybody was gullible or foolish about this, but you can see the appeal here. And this is something that has heavily affected Byron's poem and heavily changed how he is using the Blazon. This is one of many plates or illustrations from Lavater's book. And one thing I would say is it's very easy to kind of make fun of this science, so-called science. Science just means knowledge, really. And at that time, there were debates about whether this was a valid kind of knowledge. But if you think about it, today, we still, at least in our movies and our television shows and our graphic novels, we still code character, good guys, bad guys, villains, heroes, through physical features. If you draw cartoons at all and you're trying to create some kind of villain or some kind of monster, you are going to make them quite differently than perhaps your hero or your heroine. So it is something that is still operative today, and it is still something that we use even if we don't deeply believe in it. We still use it as a kind of shorthand for character. What's interesting to me as well is that Lavater pays extraordinarily little attention to women in his 3 volumes. He gives them only a few pages at the end of the 3rd volume. And here's what he says of a woman. She is capable of being formed to the purest, noblest, most seraphic virtue, to everything which can deserve praise or affection. So that sounds a lot like the Blazon, which has been going on for centuries. It sounds a lot like Byron, and it was written before Byron wrote his poem. He also says They are capable of the sweetest sensibility, the most profound emotion, the utmost humanity. Again, these are the ideas of Byron's poems. Men are most profound, women are more sublime, right? Up in the starry skies. And remember Byron's statement, he has very little, a low opinion of the female sex in terms of other qualities. Lavater also says, how much more pure, tender, delicate, but also irritable, affectionate, flexible, and patient is woman than man. Right? This is Byron's belief. Now, it's difficult to say whether these beliefs about gender fed into Lavater's or Lavater didn't create them for sure, but he's certainly fueling them by this widely read, very popular science of physiognomy. Lavater is also expressing the idea that's in this poem. What better can temper manly rudeness as the near and affectionate look of a noble, beautiful woman? Remember, she's Lady Wilmot Horton. How can the Spirit of God act more omnipotently upon the heart than by the extending and increasing physiognomical sensation for such an eloquent countenance? Now remember back to Byron's journal entry where he talks about the softening influence of a woman. But also remember where he writes to Annabella Milbank, I'm always seeking sensation. So here we have the physiognomical sensation that a woman brings to Byron. She softens him and she helps to temper all the churning emotions and the pain that his life creates in his soul. Lavater also writes, if a noble spotless maiden but appear all innocence and all soul with sympathetic goodness of heart, and think about the word innocence, that's in Byron's poem, her sympathetic softening goodness, days in goodness spent, that word is in Byron's poem. If she breathe humility and complacency, mildness, gentleness, again, words or at least ideas in the poem, if she be superior to all the powers of description, that echoes Byron's nameless grace. He can't write about it. Again, even that idea is something that exists already before Byron writes his poem. If all the glories of her angelic form be imbibed like the mild and golden rays of an autumnal evening sun, nothing so truly preserves the thoughts from brutal passion. This is almost like a prose summary of Byron's poem, written decades before he wrote. So again, this offers you a very strong material through which you can create a good analysis of the poem that's incorporating the context. And again, you can bring in the softening, soothing sounds into this reading as well as the Blazon for an even richer essay. Okay, this is over to you again. I would like you to underline or write down the words in the poem that match with Lavater's description of an ideal woman, so you get a very strong sense of the connection. And then, this is a little more challenging, I want you to think about, are there any techniques or any ideas in the poem that Byron might not have found in earlier Blazons or in writings about physiognomy? And think about, what did Byron bring to this discussion, either in the way of form or ideas? So take a few moments, pause the slideshow, and when you're ready, come back. So I've already mentioned some of the things that I've seen, and perhaps you've seen others. I've looked at words that are identical, words that are similar, words that convey a similar concept. The nameless grace, you can't quite describe this amazing kind of perfect woman. And I've also suggested that there may be actually very, very little in the poem that Byron wouldn't have been able to find in earlier examples of Blazons and in writings or public conversations about physiognomy and women. What I think Byron did bring to the form is a sense of creating a musical and imagistic performance of the effect that such a woman was supposed to have on a man, and to kind of romanticize and aestheticize and beatify these ideas as lovely things. And you might want to consider how oppressive that could have been to women who had very different personalities and who wanted to express those rather than try to play this particular role. Well, I hope that you have found these exercises useful. And I'm going to leave you with some questions for discussion. And then at the very end, I will talk a little bit about another poem that you might compare this to if your exam board requires you to do that. So here are some questions for you to think about on your own and discuss with friends, with classmates, with anybody you'd like to discuss them with. And these questions are designed to try and get us to think about how this poem might still have meaning and relevance today, even though it may initially just seem kind of alien. So I want you to think about these ideas about gender, the differences between men and women, what an ideal woman is. And I want you to think about whether you agree with them. If so, why? If not, why not? Then I want you to think about whether these ideals are still found today in any way, shape or form, and if so, where? Then think about what other ideas about women in relation to men that you have yourself or that you see expressed in society today. So what's missing from these? What are some other alternative ideas? Whether you believe them or other people, it's important to think about ideas. Very importantly, what kind of values do women's bodies get attached to today? So we've seen they're attached to property and wealth and power. We've seen that they're attached to ideas about moral character for women, which essentially are designed to keep women down and serving and below men. So that, you know, there are problems with that, unless you think that's where a woman should be. And the other thing is that, are there other values that women have, that they possess, that are being ignored or not seen because of the values that we have today that we attach to women through looking at their bodies? And that's what this question is. Does it limit the other kinds of values that a woman might have? Or do you agree with Lavater that the body is the soul? It's pretty much a metaphor, and we can see everything we need to see about any human being through their body, especially the face. Think about also if our culture still catalogues and discusses women's bodies today, and if so, in what ways? Do we dissect them? I mean, do you look in the mirror and think, oh, I wish my nose was different, or I wish I had different eyebrows? Do you kind of chop yourself up that way and measure it to an ideal? Or if you're not a woman, do you do that to women? And I mean, just even think about films which sort of chop up women's bodies. There's a famous scene in the film Psycho where a woman is stabbed to death in the shower, and because censorship didn't allow any filmmaker to show a knife touching skin, the way that Alfred Hitchcock dealt with that was to chop up the woman through editing. And it was so terrifying to Janet Leigh, who played that role. She never saw it until the first preview. She said in a radio interview, I haven't been able to take a shower since then. I have to take baths. I was so shocked at seeing, because filming it was actually quite boring. But anyway, that's just one example. There might be other ways. Think about that. And then finally, think about, do we still try to read people's character through their faces? And not just their expressions, but like the way the nose looks, or the way the mouth looks, or the hair. Do we still create types and stereotypes based on people's faces today? Also on this slide we have other resources you can look into. So there's more about Lord Byron, the 19th century bad boy. There's something about physiognomy. It's quite accessible and readable and interesting. And then if you're interested in music, I found a number of musical settings. These are just a few of them that the poem has been set to think a bit more about the music. Here are where I found the images for the slideshow. Thank you for watching, listening, and participating in this workshop. If you are interested in learning more about what it's like to study English literature or creative writing or both at university, you can start with our website. Do feel free to contact us with any questions.